Good evening, everybody. It is absolutely wonderful to be back, to say the least. We have a special guest in the audience. I don't know if you saw, but Mark is back with us, gracing. Exactly. So, in honor of his presence, roughly halfway through my presentation, he's going to come up here and glare at me from the side of the stage for a good 10, 15 minutes before I finally stop talking. We'll just keep that in mind. It's interesting also, for those of you who are wondering, the Dodgers are losing 5-0, so we don't have to worry about it. I know. Oh, really? No. Come on. Listen. I get it. Listen, I get it. You're bitter, you're jealous, we have a team, you don't. But there's one thing that every Giants and Dodgers fan has in common. We all hate the Yankees. We can appreciate that, right? Yankees. So, Yankees are the worst. They even look like comic book villains, even when they're on the field, don't they? They just look like the bad guys. Anyway, they're going to bring it home to LA to win the series for California, even you, San Francisco fans. So be prepared, as the case may be. Tonight, last year I went too long. So I deliberately try to trim my deck down, keep some high levels so we can get into the Q&A and have a little fun today. Just as a bit of a reminder, I'm based in LA, don't hold it against me. We started the company almost 20 years ago now with a very basic idea to let the data drive the answers, which is sadly lacking in today's world. And the other thing I think is worth talking about in terms of today's presentation, something you've certainly heard me talk about over the course of the last couple of years, but it's worth reiterating one more time. There's really two parts to today's talk. The first part of my talk is what we think is happening in our economy, our social narrative, our lived experience, what we see in the paper, what we come out of our politicians' mouths when they're on stage. This is what you're constantly experiencing on a day-to-day basis if you watch the news, pick up CNN, read the paper, so on and so forth. I'm also going to talk about what's actually happening in the economy, which should be the same, but obviously it's not. And what I'm talking about here is the objective statistical reality, the numbers that actually tell us what's going on. Now, when I did my PhD back in UCLA 2 years ago, by the way, it was absolutely shocking to see how young I looked in a few of those video clips right there. Really horrifying. The only thing I can say is I've clearly aged better than most of the people at PPCo, so I'll take that as a win. I'm kidding, I have not, but anyway. But again, it goes back to this idea that, we were trained about homo economists, the rational agent at the bottom of our models. And what I've seen ever since I left school and gotten into the real world is that idea, this concept that people internalize information in an objective, neutral way and process it accordingly, has fallen flat time after time after time. And what's interesting is for a long time, I think like a lot of people in economics, try to make excuses. We try to figure our way out around the problem. I won't go into the details, but if you believe in the rational agent, it is shockingly hard to come up with an economic model to explain why recessions actually occur at all. It's very interesting, but when you take a step back and you realize there's a difference between them, the world makes a lot more sense, although it also makes a lot less sense, if that makes any sense. You see what I'm saying? Here's the key. It's a combination of the two that determines where the economy goes. It's not one or the other. Narratives drive choices. They drive the choices of households. They drive the choices of business leaders. They drive the choices of our policymakers. They drive choices. But with that being said, it's economics that determines the outcome of those choices. So you have to know both, and you have to appreciate the difference to truly see what's coming down the pike. The basic rule is good choices start with the right narrative. Bad choices start with the wrong narrative. And when you get right down to it, the world I see today is a world that's making a lot of bad choices, largely on the basis of the wrong narratives. And that continues to come up time and time again. I would like to say that the world is starting to converge again, but it's not. I feel like, I don't know if this is a function of my age or a function of the changes in the world around us, particularly when it comes to thinking about the internet, but for whatever reason, these things keep getting pulled farther and farther apart, and for me it becomes more and more difficult to reconcile the difference between what we say is happening versus what the data is actually telling me. And with that being said, there's no better place than talking about the narrative of just the last couple of years. It was a couple of years ago when I was up here when we started hearing about the recession. You remember 2 years ago when all the forecasters told us recession was going to hit at any particular point in time. It was fait accompli. It was only a matter of when, not if. And yet we went all the way through 2023 on pins and needles waiting for this recession to hit, and it never happened. And when I was with you last year, I was kind of talking about this back then, right? By the end of last year, of course, confidence started to improve. We started hearing about multiple rate cuts. Inflation started cooling off. Consumer confidence started to rise. The stock market started taking off again. By the beginning of this year, we went from a recession is nigh to, wow, we're the envy of the world. Nice turnaround for 18 months, right? Mind you, 3 months later, we saw a slight uptick in the national unemployment rate. Next thing you know, 40% chance the U.S. economy is already in a recession. I mean, what is this nonsense? Over and over again. It's like the forecasting community is constantly trying to prove what Galbraith said, that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. Now, we never bought into this. We never bought into it. I contribute to the Wall Street Journal survey of forecasters. This is the average recession probability, right? And you can see all the guys were up above 60%, the average. There was one quarter where I put in 20%. I swear to God, it was nothing but peer pressure. Everybody's cranking it up, and I'm like, what am I missing? Maybe they're right. But by the next quarter, I got over it, and since then, we continue to be confident in the economy, and we're still confident. Look, if you're worried about a recession in the next 2 years, forget about it. Not going to happen. The economy's fine. Why is the economy fine? Because the consumer's fine. And if the consumer's fine, everything else is fine. The consumer is 70% of GDP. If the consumer's happy, the rest of the economy gets yanked along with them. That's just how it works. Better news? Well, the Fed's kind of backing off a bit, which will make credit a little easier. Sort of. I'll come back to what I mean by that. Labor force growth is picking up. Again, better news on that particular front. Now, with all that being said, I am worried. I'm worried more about the midterm. Because what I see today is not an economy struggling, but actually an economy that looks a little overheated. And it's overheated on the basis of the fact that we have an asset bubble, the third highest PE ratio in U.S. economic history. We have enormous federal deficits. We're seeing growing external deficits. In many ways, I feel like I did back in 2005 when I saw the economy charging forward on the basis of an impression of wealth that didn't actually exist. But it's still early 2005. Where this goes, how far it goes, remains to be seen. Best part of my job, you have to invite me back to Rinconada every single year, right? I can only give you 12 months. That's all I have. But the thing that really worries me, of course, is, and particularly this year, right, is these false narratives driving bad policy and ugly politics. And the narratives are more off base than ever before, and that's the biggest thing. I mean, look, the economy just keeps growing. It was 2 years ago we heard a recession was about to begin. And in the last 2 years, this nation has averaged 2.8% growth per quarter, every single quarter. For 2 years, this has been a remarkably good run of solid growth rates. And it's everybody who's contributing. Consumers are contributing. Investments doing better. Exports are picking up. Good solid numbers. And if you didn't catch the numbers this morning, we just got Q3 and it came in at 2.8% yet again. Another good solid quarter, the U.S. economy moves forward. And it's moving forward, yes, on the basis of good, strong consumer spending. It isn't just that consumers are spending, consumers are having the time of their lives. Global travel at an all-time high level. Did you know there's been a 45% increase in restaurant spending in the last 5 years? 45% increase in restaurant spending. Never has Vegas been busier right now. You go to Vegas, it's going to take you 45 minutes to get a cup of coffee. That's how busy Vegas is at this particular point in time, right? Nothing's going on there. Live Nation can't put on one concert without every single ticket selling out with every single VIP package. It's amazing to me to hear in the papers how people are struggling and suffering when I see this kind of data. It's a complete, it just gets in your head. What are they talking about, right? And it's true up here as well. Look, the Bay Area has been behind the curve in this recovery. It's been a slow recovery up here for a number of particular reasons. But even here, better numbers in terms of the airport activity, not back to where you were pre-pandemic, but getting there. Hotels in the Bay Area still down from where they were. Again, some of the worst numbers for travel, but look at these increases over the course of the last year. Things are finally starting to pick up, better numbers on that particular front. Overall top-line consumer debt distress, there isn't any. You know, for all the conversations about credit card debt, notice that bankruptcies right now are half of what they were in 2019. By the way, in 2019, they were at a record low level. Foreclosures, basically non-existent. And for all the increase in interest rates, people really haven't been hit by it. This is the share of household income spent on various sorts of debt obligations, mortgage debt obligations, record low level, overall debt obligations, kind of mid-level. People are doing just fine. Labor market blues. I mentioned the little bit of an increase we've seen in unemployment rate. Now, it is unusual, I will grant you. It's an odd situation to see the unemployment rate drift up when the economy is otherwise healthy. This doesn't typically occur. But with that being said, look, overall job growth is still 1.5% year over year. That's a good steady number. There's been no increase in claims for unemployment insurance. There's been no increase in people being laid off. In other words, whatever's happening with the unemployment rate, it has nothing to do with people losing their jobs. Ergo, it doesn't really matter. And of course, what's really going on here is we've had an increase in labor force growth. More important, even with the cooling off of the labor market we've seen over the last couple of years, the balance of power in our labor markets is still firmly on the sides of the workers. And yes, for all you managers in the room, I feel your pain. But this is the world, and we just live in it, right? Still, we have about 1.25 job openings for everybody looking for a job right now. Basically, we're back in 2018. And what that means is, of course, real wages continue to rise. Real wages, inflation-adjusted wages. I'm amazed by how many times people in papers constantly assert that inflation is outpacing household incomes and worker earnings. No, they're not. Quite the opposite. When you look at the data right, the average hourly wage growth is running about 3.8% year over year, and the median is about 2.5%. People are, in fact, getting ahead of the game. What about inequality? Maybe that's good for the top 20% or 10%, but everybody else is suffering. Well, even there. This is data from the Atlanta Fed Wage Tracker. It's year over year growth in nominal earnings. And this top line, by the way, is the lowest quartile of wages. The top other one here is the highest quartile of wages. Now, I know this seems completely befuddling given how papers and politicians are constantly telling us the opposite. But believe it or not, we've seen income inequality fall for a decade. Let me repeat. Income inequality has been falling for a decade. All right? Lowest quartile, 60%, highest quartile, 40%. I'm not worried about the thoracic surgeons of the world. They'll be fine. It is nice to see the bottom quartile starting to catch up. And let me say that the goal of helping those less fortunate than us is not over. We can't call it a win and chalk it off. But we can at least acknowledge the positive trends that are occurring in our economy as opposed to what's claiming it's getting worse. And that's true in the net worth front as well. No matter what level of income you are in, over the last decade, you've seen an increase in your net worth. This has been a wonderful decade. From the point of view of inequality, everybody is getting ahead. Real investments picking up. If you look at the structure of investment, a lot of this is important for Silicon Valley. Software is up there. Information processing equipment is up there. By the way, manufacturing structures is the very top of the list in terms of growth rate. That, of course, is the outcome of the CHIPS Act. By the way, there are chip factories going up everywhere. We will soon be feeding chips to our cats and dogs for food in the morning because we're going to have so many of the damn things. So that's what's driving that particular show. Even the housing market. We hear over and over and over again how we have one of the weakest existing home markets we've ever seen. The August number came out, and it was rock bottom. It was really one of the chilliest housing markets we've ever seen. But with that being said, what else is going wrong? Not much. For example, despite the fact that there's very few sales, home prices are going up. That's a critical issue. There were very few home sales in 2010. By the way, home prices were doing this. This time they're kind of doing this. It's not that housing market. That is not what's going on. And when you look a little closer, what you find is our housing market today is suffering not from a lack of buyers, but from a lack of sellers. And that is exactly why, despite the fact that affordability is not very good right now, prices do continue to drift up. And it also explains why housing starts remain relatively positive. Right now, we're running about 1 million housing starts per year on the single family size. That's better than any point in time from 2009 to 2019. That's a pretty good number. As for local, very similar sort of pictures, very few home sales, very cold market, but of course Santa Clara prices are now $1.84 million for the median price in Santa Clara County. Let that rattle around your head. $1.84 million for a 3-bedroom, 1,800 square foot slab ranch on an 1/8 of an acre lot. That is what you're getting in Santa Clara County. And believe it or not, that is up 39% from where it was 4.5 years ago. So yeah, it's expensive, but it's expensive because people are willing to buy at that price. And that is always the thing to keep in the back of your head. Now, venture capital is down. We had that enormous year in 2021 driven by the huge amount of cash flow in the economy. It has cooled off quite a bit, right? Still, the Bay Area still gets a good share of it. Back here, it was running, about a little over 40%. Now you're running a little less than 40%, so a little less. But clearly, huge decline in overall numbers. And you're seeing it in tech jobs here. You can't argue that, right? Tech jobs have been coming down. It peaked at about 350,000. You're now at about 325,000. Not a good number, to say the least. Clearly, a lot of this is about venture capital backing off. You don't have the money pouring in. But with that being said, keep something in mind. San Jose is fine. Job growth has not collapsed with tech. What's interesting, if you look at the number, job growth has gone flat. And what's happened is, you have manufacturing and information down here. These are the tech sectors, losing the jobs. But you know what's happening? Is everybody else is just filling in. Anybody who gets laid off gets a job somewhere else almost immediately. Because the dominant theme, and I'm going to come back to this over and over again, in the Bay Area, in California, in the nation overall, is labor shortages. And when you see a lack of demand for one sector in an economy that's suffering labor shortages, well, everybody else goes, oh, finally I can hire somebody. And the top of the list, of course, education and healthcare, big numbers there. Professional business services, leisure and hospitality finally starting to pick up a bit. So it hasn't meant a lot to the economy. You're just moving the jobs to a different part of the economy, and overall things keep moving forward. And for all your complaints about technology, keep something in mind. Santa Clara's median household income right now is approaching $160,000, and of course San Jose's average weekly wage of $1,900 is vastly above any place else in the nation. So maybe you don't have as many tech jobs, but man, the income numbers in this part of the world are through the roof regardless. So maybe not fast growing, but you can hardly say this is not one of the most, if not the most, prosperous economies in the entire nation. No doubt about it. More good news. Inflation is down. The S&P 500 is up. Bond rates have started to cool off a bit. You see the 10-year coming down. The 1-year is there. The Fed, of course, slashed interest rates by 0.5%. How much more good news can I give you, right? So what's the national... Oh, wait, I should point out, even Bitcoin has come back, right? Have you seen this? Bitcoin's like above 60,000 again. Now, we've talked about this. We've done a lot of work on cryptocurrencies at Beacon Economics, and my current model suggests that Bitcoin is roughly overvalued by about roughly $63,422.80, give or take 10 cents, okay? Now, if you're wondering, by the way, about our sophisticated modeling, much of it was developed from a wonderful book I read over the summer. It was a wonderful biography about an Italian-American gentleman. Lived in New York about 100 years ago. It's a fabulous rags to riches to jail to deportation story of a true American entrepreneur. And everybody in the crypto world can take, of course, a lot of pleasure in this particular story. So with all that being said, what's the national mood? Well, it's grim, right? Look, University of Michigan's confidence started to come back, but it's fading, and it's roughly where it was back in 2011. U.S. satisfaction from Gallup, very similar sort of picture. More Americans say they are living paycheck to paycheck. Now, to be clear, my wife views that as a challenge rather than a problem, but that's my issue. I won't bring it up here. Of course, in a lot of our, no doubt, a lot of our frustrations comes out of this election. This is a standard Washington Post headline, right? The economy is on the line. Which candidate do we trust to save it? I love that. Who do we trust to save the economy? Well, first of all, does this economy need saving? And second thing, what president has ever saved the economy? What nonsense is this? Why do we look at these headlines and think anything but, you're a buffoon, why is a major national paper hiring you to write anything? But of course, that's the trouble of our times, as the case may be, right? And it boils down to what I said. There are narratives and there are realities, and they are not overlapped. Look, a classic case of social narrative not being part of economic reality would be the positive value of Bitcoin. Look, snark aside, why do I think that Bitcoin doesn't have a value? Very simple, because any kid with a master's degree in computer science can make another cryptocurrency. If you can have an infinite number of cryptocurrencies, how come any of them be worth a damn? That's it, right? Now, logic aside, if I wanted to buy a Bitcoin, for fun, it's going to cost me, I don't know, $63,000 or something like that. So my logic, whatever, that's market reality. That's the world, right? The power of the narrative. What's going on? Well, don't ask me. Read the websites. Look at their propaganda videos and the logic and blah, blah, blah. And there's just masses of pages and stories and ideas and theories, and it's all about beating the man and beating the system and taking charge and blah, blah, blah. And no matter how thin you slice it, it's absolutely still baloney. But with all that being said, the number's there. So my reality is irrelevant in this particular world. And by the way, this is not new. Anybody out here invest in gold? Any of you guys gold bugs? It's okay, you can raise your hand. Anyone? No? Oh, there you go. You got a gold bug up front. I love that. Okay.
Oh, I've had it for 20 years.
Oh, fair enough, right? Probably make good money on it, right?
Well, eventually.
Eventually. I like that. Probably one of the more honest answers I get out of this. But you always ask it, well, why do you invest in gold? Well, it's an inflation hedge. Well, what do you mean? Well, when prices go up, the value of gold goes up. Yeah, well, when prices go up, the price of everything goes up. Why does that make gold particularly special? Oh, well, like 150 years ago, gold was an important part of our global commodity currency system. Oh, I agree with that. And 150 years ago, we rode horses to work and beat our kids weekly. We're not going back to that world. That's long ago history. And by the way, for gold bugs, to be clear, if you really want to know where the history of money lies, it's not gold, it's silver. Silver's vastly more important from a global commodity standpoint, right? But put all that to one side, again, the power of the narrative, the myth remains. And I'm not suggesting for a heartbeat don't invest in gold or cryptocurrency. You want to invest in it by all means. But understand what you're investing in is a narrative. Don't look for reality. Don't look for economic logic. You're investing in narratives. And that's a world that scares me. But man, there are people who've made a lot of money off of it. So, I'm still working. That's all I have to say. The other side of it, by the way, is the unsustainable federal deficit. You don't go through the number. 120% debt to GDP. 6.2% deficit to GDP. Huge obligations to Social Security, Medicare. This should be the number one crisis this nation is facing. And that is exactly why in the last presidential debate, the only presidential debate, of the 90 minutes they stand on stage, they spend approximately, what was it? How many minutes on the deficit? Zero. That's right, 0 minutes on the deficit. Now, to be clear, we could stop here and start throwing insults at Harris and Trump, but don't. Understand what these people do. They have teams of people who sit there with focus groups and they throw random ideas and see how they react. If they're not talking about the deficit, it's because their consultants have determined that we don't care about the deficit. That is a social narrative problem. Politicians are slave to the narratives. Period. Never, ever forget that. They are slaves to the narrative, no more, no less. If we don't care, they don't care. And by the way, at some point in time, reality will rain on that parade, and it's not going to be pretty. Now, when you start thinking of the world this in a way, it makes a lot more sense. Suddenly, you can see narratives everywhere, skewing our interpretation of news, skewing at the root of economic bubbles, driving bad policy choices. I mean, Schiller wrote a book a couple of years ago where he said, we need to incorporate the contagion of narratives in economic theory, otherwise we remain blind to a very real mechanism for economic change. Hear, hear. Thank you, Robert Schiller. But with that being said, one of the things that diving into the narrative has done for me is it's emboldened me to go and read history again. If you're a technical economist, the world started in 1960, because we have no good data before 1960. But if you're a narrative economist, everything is interesting, right? And I'll tell you, over 100 years ago, we already talked about this problem. One of my favorite California philosophers is Will Rogers, who famously said, it isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble, it's what we know that ain't so. He's talking about false narratives, way before Schiller won the Nobel Prize. So this is the human condition. One thing we have to keep in mind, this is not unique to us, this is the human condition. And of course, this all started with a crazy pandemic overreaction. I was up here, I said, it's gonna be a V. Turned out it was a V. Deepest recession in US economic history and the shortest recession in economic history. 8 weeks before we started bouncing back. But reality meant nothing in the narrative bubble called Washington, D.C. We lost $1.2 trillion as a result of the pandemic. They lobbed $6 trillion in stimulus at the economy, which added up to about $50,000 for every single American household. Well, no wonder the economy came out of the starting gate like a rocket, right? And it wasn't just the 50,000. Remember, the 50,000 hit the economy and every single asset price went through the roof. Homes went through the roof. Stocks went through the roof. Everything went through the roof. Crypto went through the roof. Trump's, what are they called? NFTs went through the roof, for God's sake, right? Everything did. And that $50,000 ended up causing an enormous surge in asset prices that eventually brought back $350,000 in net worth for every single American household. Well, no wonder the economy took off, right? Everybody was rich. No wonder we had fun. And that's exactly what we had. This is nominal spending by category. And again, every time you pick up the paper, you will hear about the struggles of households paying for the necessities. Now, let me show you objective reality. Of the 32% increase in personal consumption expenditures, there was 113% in air travel, 70% in foreign travel, sporting equipment, including guns, that scares me, 62%, recreational items, 55%, restaurants, 50%, new motor vehicles, 43%, and then we get down to education at 14%, food for home consumption, 24%, pharmaceuticals, housing, electricity, and gas. What are we talking about? The enormous increases in spending were on things that were bringing us fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when we look at these numbers and say, if people are really suffering. They're not, right? And of course, when there's tons of cash and tons of demand, what does that cause? It causes inflation. Of course it does. Inflation is caused by too much money chasing after too few goods. Inflation is the consequence of excess demand. One of the simplest truisms in economics, that is how it works, period. It is a function of excess demand, but we don't hear that. What do we hear all the time? How bad things are. I think I showed this to you last year. I just love this survey. It came out in 2022, but it's so wonderful. 85% of Americans are feeling impact of inflation in day-to-day lives. Second bullet, 88% said inflation has impacted their spending at restaurants. I just showed you the number, a 50% increase in restaurant spending. What? Well, there's two answers to this, right? One is that the other 12% of Americans are spending a lot of time in restaurants. The more likely, of course, answer is that what we're getting here is not truth. It's narrative. Look, whenever you see the word survey, understand you're not getting reality. You're getting someone's interpretation of reality. You're getting their narrative. It's as simple as that. That is what you're collapsing. 70% of consumers feel inflation is outpacing income. They may feel that way, but it's not true. I just showed you the data. Or even The Economist magazine, right? Could the inflation nightmare soon be over? I love that. The inflation nightmare What nightmare? It's going to take me 7 months to get my brand new BMW X6 delivered? What nightmare exactly are we talking about? But nevertheless, this is how we handle it, and it gets into our heads. And that, of course, brings me to psychology lesson number 1 tonight. Because I thought I'd go a little psychology for you, right? What is going on here? I've been reading a lot of books. I don't know if any of you have heard of a guy named Daniel Kahneman, won the Nobel Prize in economics. By the way, he was not an economist. He studied psychology. He just passed away recently. An insanely bright human being. Wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talked about the human decision-making process, how we think about things. And what he said was, our decision-making processes can be broken into 2 parts, type 1 and type 2 thinking. Type 2 thinking, well, that's your rational brain. That's the brain you kind of rules the world. When you're sitting in the morning and you're thinking in your head and you're calculating something on a piece of paper, or talking to your friend or your spouse, it's type 2 that's in charge. And type 2 is a great system. Type 2 is incredibly powerful. It's allowed us to master elements of our universe that no one could have possibly dreamed about. We know it's at the heart of the atom. We understand the age of the universe. We can figure out how to pay our income taxes. We're smart people, right? But with all that being said, your type 2 system has fundamental limitations. We like to think that we're all about type 2 thinking, but we are not. Type 2 thinking is, first of all, it's one track. You cannot think hard about 2 things simultaneously. You can't. You can think about one thing hard at a time, period. We are one-track people. And by the way, it's also tiring. We all know working hard on anything is exhausting. You sit there in your computer, you're exhausted. It's like you ran a race. So type 2 is very often lazy, very often busy. It's there, it's important, but it just doesn't have the capacity to be in charge all the time. Okay, well, if type 2 isn't running the show, who is? It's type 1. And type 1 is your old-fashioned brain. It's your emotional brain. Think of it this way. If your type 2 is your digital brain, your type 1 is your analog brain, okay? It's the old-fashioned system. They came out of millions of years of evolution. Type 2 came late in the game. Type 2 is an amazing system. It's quick. It's instinctive, it's emotional, it's rapid, it's incredible. But with that being said, we have to understand what type 1 was developed to do. Type 1 was largely developed to prevent your ancestors from being eaten. That's what it was for, right? So with that being said, you have to keep something in mind, that when it comes to type 1, it's very, very good at making rapid decisions with limited information. Remember that. Rapid decisions, limited information. You hear a rustling in the bushes on a dark night, you bolt 100 yards down the path, and then you turn around to see what it was. All right? Type 1 got you the first 100 yards. Type 2 said, maybe it's just a chipmunk, okay? But type 1 ran the show, and it has done so very, very well. But again, it is fast, it's instinctive and emotional, and because of that, it is full of what we call cognitive biases. Cognitive biases. What's a cognitive bias? Well, you might have heard of these: confirmation bias, extension neglect, false prisors, logical fallacy. The easiest way to think about a cognitive bias is, of course, an optical illusion. Simple optical illusion, right? You look at this, okay? You're up front. Work with me. I may have used this with you last year.
You did.
I did. All right, let's get somebody else in the audience. There you go. You got horizontal lines there. Are they parallel?
It's hard to tell, but I'm going to say no.
Okay, I love that. First of all, he said it's hard to tell, which meant his type 1 and type 2 brain were conflicting.
Yep.
Type 2 brain said they are not parallel. Type 2 brain said they're parallel. Why? Why the hell would he ask that question otherwise? That's good deductive logical thinking. Type 1 said they're not parallel. Why? What's going on here? Your type 1 system for seeing, okay, is designed not just to see shapes, that's a tiger. It's also designed to see depth. It's a tiger that's that far away. Now here's the key. The way it sees depth has to do with shading. And these little squares screw with your shading system. Thus it screws you with your depth perception. Thus it makes these lines not look parallel when in fact they are absolutely 100% parallel. That is a cognitive bias. And that goes back to what I was saying. If type 2 is there, you know it's an optical illusion, and you can proceed accordingly. But what if type 2 isn't attuned to this? What if type 2 isn't on top of the game? Well, you just look at this briefly. Well, they're not parallel. Now think about every bit of information entering your brain having the same issue. Unless type 2 is there all the time to be paying specific attention to what that data is, who knows what you're going to believe, right? Who knows? And that's the key. That's the scary part about it. We don't think as much as we think we think. Simple as that. You're wondering what that is. It's a whole bunch of people going up the escalator to a 24-hour fitness. See my point? We don't think as much as we think we think. Now, you think about what happened over the last couple of years, and it's been a very interesting couple of years, in part because of the consumer cycle. We had the big pandemic implosion, and then we had the explosion of spending, particularly on the goods front, because that's all you could do at the beginning of it. And then the Fed kicks in, inflation kicks in, the Fed kicks in, we had the big cooling off, and now we're just getting back to normal. If I said, what's happening in 2024? Consumers are back to normal. Saving is back to 5%. We're back to the same mix of goods and services. We have enough stuff in our garage. We're spending more time traveling. All sorts of good stuff just like that. The key here is, despite all those shifts, what is the outlook for consumers? And the answer there is still positive. For all that negative rhetoric, real disposable income continues to rise. Household net worth. You know, what's interesting is the Fed got in the game. They're yanking money out of the economy, the quantitative tightening. Asset prices fell briefly, and they took off again. If you look at the numbers today, we're actually up from where we were even a couple of years ago. Americans now have $47 trillion more in net worth today than they did back by the pandemic. That's $450,000 on average per American household. So we're still incredibly rich, and all that means consumers are fine. And going back even to the debt situation, look, you hear all the time about how credit card delinquencies are going up, auto delinquencies are going up. But this is kind of interesting. If you actually look at, for example, credit card debt as a share of disposable income, believe it or not, it's low. Back before the Great Recession, credit card debt was 8% of disposable income. Today it's 5%. So we don't have a quantity of debt problem. So why are we having problems with credit cards? Well, I figured this out the other day when I saw this in the Wall Street Journal. Turns out there are 12 million full-time influencers in the United States. This might have something to do with the credit card problem. Just saying, okay? But again, this is having to do with a specific set of people, not a systemic problem. But if you don't know that, if you're not paying attention to that, well, you start to think it's a real problem. You think it's an overall economy problem. It's not. So why do we get so sucked into this? Well, there's a whole other part of it too. Look, when you think about type 2 and type 1 thinking, there's another metaphor for it called the elephant and the rider. And the argument here is that your type 2 thinking, your intellect, that's the rider. The elephant, that's your emotions. That's type 1. The reason we bring this up is, for the most part, when your type 2 system tells type 1 what to do, type 1 kind of goes along with it. But with that being said, type 1's in charge. The rider has the illusion of control. But if the elephant goes left, the elephant's going to go left. It doesn't matter what the hell the rider says. And that's the key. Every time you pick up a paper, you hear nothing but bad news. Depression, recession, failure, down, reduction, everything's terrible, everything's tragic. And unless you're constantly thinking about this stuff, it gets into your head. You start to think things really are bad when they're not. This is the human condition. Look, I'm weird. I'm an economist. I'm steeped in these numbers. I'm the rare human being whose type 2 system is constantly attuned to this nonsense. But most people are not. And here's where it gets even weirder. You know, Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind says, the rider evolved to serve the elephant. The rider evolved to serve the elephant, not the other way around. The rider came way after the elephant was around. And where that gets interesting is where people actually, what you see is the elephant, okay, you're going this way, and the rider says, goes right, and the elephant says, no, I'm going left. And what is interesting about your type 2 system is it doesn't just go, well, okay, I guess we're going left. It actually starts inventing reasons for why we go left. It's called post hoc rationalization, post hoc justification, where we fall over ourselves trying to develop rational reasons for our feelings. when the reality is their feelings are wrong. And therein lies the rub. This is where things get ugly. And this tells me everything I need to know. This is probably one of the best graphs I've found. One of my folks found this, the Federal Reserve. This is a survey they do where they ask a bunch of people, how are you doing? On a scale of 1 to 100. And the average person in 2017 said 74, 75, 75. You can see the numbers bouncing around. Today it's 72, okay? So in other words, the average person's doing just as well as they were 5 or 6 years ago. I'd argue they're doing a little better, but we'll make amends for that, right? What gets really interesting is when you ask people how everybody else is doing. And this is how everybody else is doing in your neighborhood, and this is how everybody else is doing in the country. Look at these numbers. Look how they're down. So in other words, the average person thinks, I'm fine. But the average person thinks the average person is not fine. It doesn't work that way, okay? For example, 90% of parents think their kids are above average. It doesn't work that way. I got 2. One of them is highly likely to be a dumbass. It's just one thing I'm coming to grips with. I don't know which one yet, but at some point in time I'm going to figure this out, right? And even in the housing front, right? Every time you turn around, oh, you can never buy a house. Maybe things are fine, but you can never afford a house, right? And this is a sentiment. Is it a good time to buy a house? And this is Gallup. Never have anybody been so pessimistic, I will never be able to afford a house. Ever, ever, ever. And of course they believe that. Look at this. Homes are now unaffordable in 99% of the U.S. 99% of the U.S. homes are unaffordable. Now, mind you, every one of those houses that was purchased by somebody who clearly could afford it. So we know that isn't true. But these are the headlines that get into people's face. Now, let's actually talk about the reality of that. I did my little affordability metrics, and work with me. This is 100% LTV plus upkeep relative to household income. And yes, affordability has gotten bad in the last couple of years, no doubt about it, because of the big increase in interest rates. But take a look at this picture in totality. Affordability today is roughly where we were in the 80s and just a hair higher in the 90s. Does this look like the worst market ever? But go to the next step. What about from 2009 to 2020 when housing had never been more affordable? Let me repeat. From 2009 to 2020, housing in the U.S. had never been more affordable. So why weren't we buying homes? Because we were telling people they weren't affordable. That's the power of the narrative. I was here in 2019. Does anybody remember 2018, 2019? And we had these conversations. Why is real estate so cold? And my answer was, I don't know. Now I know. The narrative. The narrative was housing's overpriced. And so everybody stood on the side waiting for home prices to fall, thus making the housing market colder, thus proving to people the housing was overpriced, causing more people to stand on the sidelines. The power of the narrative. I had people in 2018 and 2019 walk up to me going, so when are home prices going to fall? The answer, never. Never. Because they've never been more affordable. But that's the power of the narrative, right? Now, what's interesting is how do narratives bust? Well, you got a first-hand view of what happens with narratives as to what happened during the course of the pandemic. You know, it was roughly August of 2020 when everybody was stuck inside and they had piles of cash and interest rates were 2%. And they said, you know, I'm tired of waiting for home prices to fall. We've been stuck inside. We need a bigger house because I hate my children. I suggest we go look at an open house. Okay, I heard there's one around the corner. Let's go ahead and do it. And they put their masks on, because we ought to wear masks, and they walked down the street, and they saw a line of 479 people with masks on, waiting in line to see the very same open house. And man, did that narrative get blown up in a hurry. And we went from homes are overpriced, they're going to fall any second now, to oh my God, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. And home prices went up by 50% in 2 years. So the power of the narrative, you hold back reality, and then when it busts through, watch out. It's like the collapse of the Hoover Dam. And that's exactly what we saw out there, right? Same with our state. Where's California? Again, what's the narrative? According to the right, we're a failing economy. We're failing because of our socialist policies that are driving rich people and businesses out of the state willy-nilly. By the way, the narrative of the left, we're a failing state. We're a state that's failing our people. We're a state that's defined by screaming inequality and home prices that no one can afford. Okay, so which one are we? Are we a socialist hellhole or are we a capitalist hellhole? Can someone please give me a sense of where we're going here? Which way is it? Can't be both, can it? Right? Kind of kooky. Now we have a third narrative, by the way, from the governor. It's fine. Everything's fine. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. It's fine, right? And no, I'm not running for president, I promise. Now, by the way, if I had to go through these narratives and say which one is it, it's actually Newsom's. He's mostly right. It is mostly fine. Look, I get it. Our unemployment rates come up a bit, more so than other places. We haven't grown as much as California or Texas. But with that, there's been no increase in unemployment insurance, plenty of business applications, the job openings rate still where it was in 2019. Output's growing faster, our incomes are growing faster. Prior to the pandemic, per capita income in the state was about 16% of more than the nation. Today it's 20% more. What are we talking about? So we're growing a little slower, but we still have the richest people in the nation. Our incomes are going up. Our economy's doing great, right? The difference, of course, is something I've talked about year after year after year. Our labor force doesn't grow. Simple as that. Here's the simple rule. In the last 5 years, we've added 13,000 people to our labor force and 640,000 to our payroll jobs. That's kind of an interesting statistic when you think about it. Actually, if you ask, I think we're doing pretty damn well, all said and done. Right? Of course, the biggest issue, we don't build housing like Texas does. Ergo, we can't grow a labor force the way Texas does. Ergo, we can't grow the way Texas does. This isn't complicated. Well, it is complicated because people are leaving. They're fleeing. Remember? Population declines. People fleeing the state of California. I always love that term, fleeing. Fleeing. Such a powerful word because it gives us a distinctive narrative, but it also gives us a testable implication. If people are fleeing, what happens to housing vacancy rates? Imagine we're Florida, we're Tampa, and there's a Class 5 hurricane ripping across the Gulf, about to hit Tampa. What happens to vacancy rates in Tampa? They go up, right? People are fleeing, vacancy rates are going up. Well, guess what? Vacancy rates are not going up in California. So we already have a problem with the word flee. Okay, here's it even gets more interesting. Turns out we have fewer people in California. We have more households. Fewer people, more households. And that is the critical issue. We have a collapse in people per household. And because we're having collapse in people per household in a limited housing stock, well, as people spread out, somebody has to get out. That is the functional issue. Now, why are people spreading out? That's the bigger question. And the answer is they're spreading out because they are doing well. So here you have a very interesting situation because the population of California is declining because people are doing well, right? Look, when I was 23, I had 2 roommates. I had to. That's how you could afford a house. And that, by the way, was in Buffalo, New York, okay? Now, how many 23-year-olds in California have roommates still? All right? Not many. You don't do that anymore. That's not how kids live. And when they do better, they spread out. Remember, I think I told you this last year. Always keep in mind the 3 worst things any human being can live with: bed bugs, cockroaches, and anyone you're not related to. Okay? Simple as that. Those are the 3 biggest pests on the planet. People spread out. Simple as that. And take a look at Santa Clara County. Santa Clara County has seen its population grow by a mere 0.7%. With that being said, the overall growth in occupied housing is up 8.4%. So vastly more household growth than population growth because, yes, of a big decline in people per household. Every bit of new housing stock built in Santa Clara County has not been occupied by people moving here, but by people moving out from the place next door. That is the functional problem. When people are doing well, you have to build enough housing for people who already live here, and then you have to add in even more to get more people to move here. And we're not doing that. We're not building enough to even meet current demand, much less to allow more people to move here, which is why labor forces are falling, which is exactly the constraint on the San Jose economy, on the Bay Area economy. There's no growth in the labor store. And even going to the idea of tech. I know tech jobs are falling, but let's talk about it in a modestly different way. Let's talk about tech as a percent of households, right? So basically, say in 2016, tech was about 11% of all people working in the Bay Area. Today, it's at 13%. Outside of this weird little period of the pandemic, the highest it's ever been. You want to know what the real problem with tech is? Well, there's nobody to hire. And consider, go back to what I just said before, talking about these incredibly high wages being paid already in the area. Well, those high wages, again, are a function of the fact that there's not a lot of supply of new workers. This is the biggest issue. Now, the reason I bring this all up is I want to talk about a thing called Dutch disease, okay? Now, for those of you who are wondering what Dutch disease is, Dutch disease, to be clear, is a very simple idea. It all came out of the Netherlands going back in the 1950s. 1950s, Netherlands had one of the strongest manufacturing bases in Europe. By the end of 1960, it was wiped out completely. What happened? Oil. Oil pops up. Suddenly, every strong, strapping young Dutch worker moves out into the oil fields, and every single factory closed because there was no one to hire. And that's great when oil prices were high, but when oil prices fell, well, suddenly there's nothing left to hold up the economy, and everything fell apart because there was no manufacturing base. Well, that is exactly what's happening in San Jose. But your Dutch disease isn't oil, it's big tech. It's Google. It's Apple. And they continue to grow in a constrained economy, and they're squeezing everybody else out. And then, of course, when venture capital cools off a bit, when tech cools off a bit, well, the entire Bay Area feels it. But the way to get around Dutch disease is to allow for labor force growth, which is a function of housing stock, and that's what the reason isn't doing, right? Now, what we are worrying about is not growing our housing stock. We're panicked about inequality in the state. That's the biggest thing, right? But again, let's be clear. Poverty rates in California have never been lower than they are right now. By the way, over the course of the last 4 years, Hispanic and African American households have seen more income growth than whites or Asians. Now again, no one's suggesting that inequality is no longer a problem, but we can all be glad that things are moving in the right direction and applaud the successes we've already made and just lean in and keep doing it. But no. We got to say that a third of Californians are living near poverty, which isn't true. It's complete false, right? And, of course, we're talking about Prop 32, which is cranking up the minimum wage to $18 an hour. Now, mind you, the $18 an hour minimum wage doesn't mean anything to San Jose. It's irrelevant to San Francisco. But you know where it matters? Fresno, Bakersfield, Riverside. It's amazing to me how everybody forgets about those economies where this is completely, utterly, totally inappropriate. And as far as that goes, we know the unemployment rate's going up. Why is the unemployment rate going up in the state? Kids. The increase in the unemployment in the state of California is 16 to 19-year-olds. Why can't 16 to 9-year-olds not get a job? Well, because the minimum wage is $16 an hour in most places and $20 an hour in fast food restaurants. And you wonder why kids can't get a job. Of course they can't. And by the way, it's not your kids. Your kids are fine. It's the kids from at-risk neighborhoods who can't get the job. And by the way, your first job is incredibly important to your lifetime success. So here we are hurting kids on the basis of fighting a battle that doesn't exist. That to me is a problem. It really is. Or even the affordability issue, right? Look, why are rents going up? Because incomes are going up. Renters are doing fine. I know they're spreading out. Simple as yet. Yet we're talking about rent control. You think rent control is going to help housing supply? It's going to go the wrong way. What about the narratives on Fed policy here, right? Well, the Fed thinks, of course, that they had nothing to do with inflation. But putting all that to one side, they're not going to cut rates. They're not going to cut rates. Well, guess what? They're finally cutting rates. Great news, right? Keep something in mind. Two things they did. They cranked up the federal funds rate. They've also been quantitative tightening. Remember quantitative tightening? I talked about it the last couple of years. That's shrinking the money supply. The reason that's, of course, is of issue is it is the decline in the money supply that's putting, of course, pressure on the lending system. And what's interesting is they said, we're going to cut the federal funds rate, but we're going to continue quantitative tightening. In other words, what the Fed's doing is not stimulating the economy, but trying to unwind the yield curve. So don't expect credit constraints are going to immediately be lifted because they continue to squeeze the money supply down on the basis of quantitative tightening, as simple as that. And remember, that inflation is not Powell's only legacy. We also have the enormous asset bubble. It's amazing to me they cut the federal funds rate when the PE ratio in the US stock market was the third highest it has ever been, okay? Third highest. Why would you do that? Well, again, are you more worried about the pressure on the banking system, or are you more worried about the bubble? He decided the banking system is more important. He's probably right on that particular front. And of course, it's also the federal deficit, which he certainly enabled. With all that being said, understand, the US today, if anything, is overheating. We can see it in the growing current account deficit. We can see it in terms of our foreign surpluses as well. So with all that being said, we're just a couple days away. Let's lean in. Here's the key. You know, I get it. These are two entirely different people in every way, shape, or form.
No kidding.
No kidding. Except for when it comes to economic policy. They're remarkably the same. First of all, they both agree the economy is doing terrible and it's all their fault. Economy's not doing terrible. It's doing fine. No one needs to rescue this economy, period. And of course, fiscal policy, both have been talking about taxing less and spending more, slightly different balances, but it's the same damn thing, right? And of course, they're both worried about industry, but the worries are not about how to, for example, fix immigration and get enough workers into the country. Instead, they're talking about subsidies and tariffs. So what I hear is two politicians going populist on us, offering us a bunch of solutions for economy that doesn't need any solutions. Now, honestly, I don't see a big difference between these two people. For all the noise and all the hubbub, I don't see a lot of difference. And that isn't good, by the way. That means there isn't a right pick. Not that there's a wrong one, but there isn't a right one. Because they're not in touch. But I'm going to go back to what I just said. They're just telling us what we want to hear. They are slaves to the narrative. We're not out of the woods because we were never in the woods. Consumer demand is nice and strong. The expansion is going to continue. No issues there. Headwinds will intensify. Absolutely they will. Fed deficits, frothy asset markets, external imbalances. If you have to pay attention to numbers, the US dollar, or the US household savings rate, and the yield curve. These are the three things. These are the three big numbers you need to be paying attention to. The dollar in particular, because as the dollar starts to do this, it means foreign investors are no longer interested in investing in our economy, and watch out. As for California, we continue to try and prove that the road to hell is paved with good intention. No other way of putting it. Dutch disease is the biggest issue facing the state. And it's not just in San Jose I see this. It's not just in San Francisco. I see it in Napa. I see it in Monterey County. I see it all over the place. If you will not build enough housing to provide for growth, the economy is going to get squeezed. And that is all you see in this state. Simple as that. But ultimately, we can't fix that until we fix the narrative. And that lies, of course, the biggest issue of all. The narrative is running amok, and it's leaving political chaos in its wake. These are the issues, as simple as that. And on that basis, you know, it's so interesting to me because I had a little epiphany the other day, and it boils down to this. We live in the age of information. We can go to the internet and find out pretty much anything you want. If you want to see data, go to FRED, F-R-E-D, Federal Reserve Economic Data from the St. Louis Fed. There are hundreds and thousands of data series available on that website for people to peruse. We live in a world of unimaginable wealth of information. Why is everybody so stupid? And the answer is because we are human. This is a great quote from the Pew Charitable Trust. New information platforms feed the ancient instinct people have to find information that syncs with their perspective. People tend to seek information that aligns with their views. This is not the age of information. This is the age of confirmation bias. No matter what you believe, you will find someone on the internet that agrees with you. And that may be that taxes hurt growth and inequality is widening, or the earth is flat and Australia doesn't actually exist. Look it up. That is an honest-to-God conspiracy theory right now. Australia does not exist. And this is the issue we have. It's confirmation bias. And we all have to recognize that tendency in ourselves. If you want to fix this, you first have to start with the fact that I am a creature of confirmation bias. We all do this. We all do it constantly. And until we can let go of that, I don't know how we fix this. Simple as that. It's easier to fool people and convince them they have been fooled. So with that, by the way, you may have noticed the QR code here. If you want to get a copy of the slide set, you could take a picture of that. You will get it mailed in. And with that, Q&A.